What's up guys, it's Dominic. Welcome back to my channel. Thanks for stopping by. Today we're going to be talking about exposure and the exposure triangle. Do you ever get frustrated with pictures that you're taking on automatic, point and shoot camera, your iPhone, and the subject is very dark because your exposure is off? And what exposure is the exact amount of light that you let into your camera to hit your sensor. If the exposure is off, the whole picture is trash. I've seen so many great photos being ruined by bad exposure. And a lot of photographers believe that you can pull them back in post, and that is true to a certain extent, but it's always best to nail your exposure in camera. What is exposure exactly? Well, it's associating three components that the camera can control to allow a certain amount of light to hit that sensor. Those components are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now the association of those three components come together and work in unison to get different exposures, and then there's some byproducts of each of those components as well. Today we're going to be focusing on aperture. I had a real hard time with aperture, and that's because the numbers involved in aperture are actually inverse, so larger numbers mean smaller things and yada yada. We're going to get into it right now. So right now I have the Canon G7X, one of my favorite little cameras, and it's just going to demonstrate a few things for you. But most notably I want you to notice what is called the iris of the little lens inside of this camera. Now, the iris of that lens can open or close, and that is the component called aperture. It is how large or how small or how wide or how narrow that iris of the lens opens up to allow a certain amount of light to come in. And that iris is made up of a number of different blades, and those blades make up a circle. And when those blades open up, the iris gets larger. When those blades close down, the iris gets smaller. Obviously, the larger that iris, the more light comes in. The smaller that iris, the less light comes in. I'm sure you're asking why you would ever want less light to come in. If it's a very bright day outside and your camera just can't have that much light, you don't want that image blown out or overexposed. So you want less light to come in, you'd close that aperture down and shut that iris down to let less light in. Now let's talk about the numbers. The numbers of aperture are a little bit tricky, but we're gonna walk through it real easily. Basically, the larger the aperture, the bigger that iris, the more light that comes in, the smaller the number. So f2, f1.8, f1.4, those are all very small numbers and very large apertures. So that iris is very large, allowing a lot of light to come in. I love shooting what's called wide open or large apertures, getting that down to an f1.4. It's one of my favorite looks in photography. It allows a lot of light to come in. It's really beautiful images. Now, a byproduct of aperture. So let's talk about f22 versus f1.8, two very common apertures. A byproduct of aperture, and something you really need to keep in mind and understand, is something called depth of field. And what depth of field is how narrow or how deep the focus is in your image. Meaning, have you ever seen a really beautiful image that the subject is isolated from the background? So the subject is in focus and everything behind that subject is very blurry. It's called bokeh. And it's a very beautiful way to portray a subject and isolate them from anything else in that image. I love that look. I shoot it a lot. What that is a very shallow depth of field. So the subject is in focus and then everything behind it is out of focus. A very deep depth of field is larger aperture numbers. So f1.4 is going to isolate that subject. Very narrow depth of field. f22, very deep depth of field. Everything's gonna be in focus. You're gonna be in focus. Those mountains 30 miles behind you are gonna be in focus. So depth of field is a very important tool in photography, and it's a byproduct directly of your aperture numbers. One thing to keep in mind when you're talking about aperture is sharpness of your images. And some lenses vary in sharpness depending on how opened up or how closed down they are in their lens and aperture setting. The more you stop down that lens, the more you open it up, those sharpnesses do tend to change, and it varies lens to lens, so a lot of times you have to test out the lens that you're shooting. What I like to do is really stay in that middle range. I find that most lenses are sharpest between f4 and f8, or f5.6 and f8. Those are kind of the ranges where most lenses really hit that sharpness and really crisp. The more you open up, get down to those f2, f1.8, f1.4, you'll get a really beautiful image, but you will sacrifice some sharpness there, and you'll get a little bit of a softer image. I'm okay with it. A lot of times I think it's worth it, especially the bokeh that you get, and the softness of the image actually is kind of nice on some of the faces, but On some faces, whoa, calling them out. But anyway, that's just something to keep in mind when talking about aperture as well. Another byproduct is the sharpness of the lens at what aperture range is. So that is aperture as a whole. And that is just one component of the exposure triangle. Check out my next video for shutter speed. That's what we're going to be going over next. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'm Dominic from Dominic Phillip Photography. I appreciate your view. Talk to you soon.